Welcome to the Urban Herald Deep Dive.
Yeah.
We're part of the team here, and today we're digging into something huge, a concept that really did change everything. And it all started, amazingly, with just 2 words jotted down in a notebook back in, 1837? I think.
That's right. We're talking Charles Darwin and his revolutionary idea, evolution by natural selection. I mean, for our listeners, you've got to understand, this is up there with Newton, with Einstein. It completely reshaped how we see life, time, ourselves.
Yeah, it proved we aren't just sort of placed here, fixed. We're part of this vast, unfolding, branching story.
Exactly, a continuous process.
So our mission today, here at the Urban Herald, is to trace that journey. We've got some great source material that maps out Darwin's decades of work, how he went from this curious kid collecting beetles to the person who fundamentally flipped our understanding of our place in nature.
It's a story of incredible patience, observation, and, let's be honest, intellectual courage. Huge risk involved.
Definitely. And why Darwin now? I mean, it's over 150 years later.
Because it's absolutely not just history. His framework, it's alive and kicking. Variation, selection, inheritance. These are the principles driving things we see every day. Think about antibiotic resistance in hospitals.
Right, or even how new COVID variants pop up. It's the same engine at work.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's not just biology. You can see these same dynamics in how information spreads online, how ideas or even, memes catch on and change.
So it's a kind of timeless way to understand change in any complex system. Biological, sure, but digital, cultural, too. Fascinating.
Okay.
Okay, let's rewind. Back to the beginning. Charles Robert Darwin, born February 12, 1809, Shrewsbury, England. What was he like as a kid? What drove him?
Well, it seems to boil down to this deep, almost solitary curiosity. He wasn't necessarily bookish in the traditional sense, but he was obsessed with collecting things from nature. Beetles, shells, rocks.
Just constantly observing, categorizing.
Exactly, roaming the countryside for hours. And you can see how that early hands-on approach, that sort of methodical collecting, really laid the groundwork for his later scientific method, the skill of just looking closely.
And there's a personal angle, too, isn't there? His mother died when he was only 8.
Yes, and while he later said he didn't remember much about her, some sources suggest this loss might have pushed him inward, made him more introspective. Perhaps the natural world felt, more stable, more reliable.
A source of wonder, maybe even escape.
Could be. But interesting contrast. This kid, fascinated by nature, he was apparently terrible at school. Shrewsbury School, classical education, it just didn't click. He was daydreaming about adventures in the tropics.
Reading things like The Wonders of the World instead of doing his Latin, I bet.
Sounds about right. So his father, a successful doctor, thought, right, medicine it is, sent him off to Edinburgh University in 1825.
Which didn't take either, did it? Hated the surgery, apparently.
Couldn't stand it. But Edinburgh wasn't a total wash. This is where, sort of under the radar, some crucial seeds were planted.
How so?
He fell in with Professor Robert Grant, a marine biologist. Grant was one of those figures, quietly discussing ideas about species changing, about evolution, away from the mainstream. It wasn't the dominant view at all, but it exposed Darwin to the possibility.
Which brings us to the climate back then. What was the dominant view? What did everyone, especially the establishment, believe about species?
The absolute bedrock belief, particularly in England with the powerful Church of England, was fixism. Species were created exactly as they are now, unchanging, permanent, humans at the top, of course.
And questioning that wasn't just scientifically debatable.
Well, no, it was basically heresy. It challenged the entire religious and social order.
But fixism wasn't the only idea floating around, even if it was dominant. What about Lamarck?
Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in France. He's key not because his mechanism was right, but because he dared to suggest species could change over time. That was radical in itself.
He had that idea about the giraffe stretching its neck and passing that stretched neck on, the law of use and disuse.
That's the one. And an inner drive towards perfection. The mechanism inheritance of acquired characteristics, we now know that's not how it works. You don't pass on muscles you built at the gym, biologically speaking.
But why is he still important for Darwin's story, then?
Because he cracked the door open. He normalized the idea that life wasn't fixed, that species could transform, that the Earth was likely older than the Bible suggested. He started the argument against fixism. Darwin needed that ground broken, even if Lamarck's specific theory was off base.
Okay, so Darwin ditches medicine. His father, probably exasperated, pushes him towards the church, off to Cambridge in 1827 to become an Anglican priest.
And here's the great irony, isn't it? This path, meant to lead him into the heart of the religious establishment, actually puts him directly in touch with the science that would ultimately challenge it.
How did that happen at Cambridge?
He met John Stevens Henslow, professor of botany, also a clergyman. Henslow saw something in Darwin, that passion, that incredible eye for detail, despite his, let's say, patchy academic record.
You became a real mentor.
Absolutely crucial. Henslow nurtured his scientific talent, taught him rigorous observation, classification, fieldwork. He took Darwin under his wing.
And that connection led directly to the Beagle.
It did. In 1831, Henslow gets asked to recommend a naturalist, really more of a gentleman companion, for Captain Robert Fitzroy on HMS Beagle. The ship was heading off on a surveying voyage around South America. Henslow thought of Darwin.
A 22-year-old, not even formally trained as a scientist in the way we'd think of it now.
Exactly. Henslow vouched for him, persuaded Fitzroy, persuaded Darwin's reluctant father. And that decision, based on recognizing potential over credentials, it changed the course of science.
Right. So December 27th, 1831, HMS Beagle sets sail. A 5-year journey begins. Darwin's aboard, not just with his collecting jars, but with some important intellectual baggage, too. What was he reading?
The big one, the game changer, was Volume 1 of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. It had just been published.
Lyell, and his big idea was
Uniformitarianism. Basically, the idea that the geological features of the Earth, mountains, valleys, canyons, were formed by the same slow, gradual processes we can still see happening today. Erosion, sedimentation, uplift, acting over incredibly vast stretches of time.
which was a radical departure from the idea of, say, Noah's flood carving the Grand Canyon overnight. Catastrophism.
Precisely. Catastrophism fit with a young Earth, maybe 6,000 years old, based on literal biblical interpretation. Lyell was talking deep time. Millions, maybe hundreds of millions of years.
And why was that timescale so critical for Darwin's thinking?
Because natural selection, the accumulation of tiny, almost imperceptible variations generation after generation, well, it needs time, lots and lots of time. Fixes and works fine if the Earth is young, but if the Earth itself changes slowly, profoundly over immense ages.
Then maybe life could too.
Exactly. Lyell gave Darwin the canvas, the vast timescale upon which gradual biological change could plausibly occur. It unlocked the possibility in his mind.
So the Beagle's main job was mapping coastlines, right? Hydrographic surveys. Darwin's role was more opportunistic.
Officially, yes, he was the naturalist, there to observe and collect specimens of rocks, plants, animals. But the way he did it, the meticulous notes, the careful preservation and labeling, connecting the geology he saw with the life he found, he essentially set the standard for modern field research.
First major stop that really blew him away was Brazil, the rainforest.
Absolutely. He landed near Salvador, walked into the Atlantic forest, and was just overwhelmed. The sheer diversity, the abundance of life, the complexity. He wrote about it with this incredible sense of wonder. It just didn't seem like something simply stamped out by a creator.
But his journals also show another side there, don't they? His reaction to slavery.
Very strongly. He was deeply disturbed, repulsed by the brutality he witnessed. It reflects his liberal abolitionist family background, his own developing sense of ethics. It's an important dimension. He wasn't just a detached observer.
Okay, heading south. Patagonia. This is where things get really interesting geologically and paleontologically.
Huge discoveries here. He unearthed these massive fossils of extinct creatures, giant ground sloths, megatherium, huge armadillo-like things called glyptodons, creatures unlike anything alive today in terms of size.
But, and this is the key,
But they looked remarkably similar in their basic body plan to the much smaller sloths and armadillos still living right there in that same part of South America.
not like finding a fossil hippo in England. It was like finding a giant version of something local.
Exactly. This strongly challenged the idea that species were created uniquely and then just wiped out and replaced by entirely different ones. It suggested continuity.
A kind of local succession.
That's the term. It hinted that species might arise from pre-existing related species in the same region, that maybe the giant sloth was an ancestor or closely related to the ancestor of the modern sloth. A huge conceptual leap away from fixism.
Further south again, Tierra del Fuego. His encounters with the indigenous Yamana people. That seems like a complex experience for him.
It was. He observed both individuals who had spent time being educated in England and those living traditionally. It was his first real, sustained encounter with significant human cultural difference. Those observations definitely fed into his later, more controversial thoughts on human evolution and race, reflecting the biases of his time, unfortunately.
And then the place everyone associates with Darwin,
Mm.
the Galápagos Islands, September 1835.
Right. This isolated volcanic archipelago, a natural laboratory, as it's often called.
What were the immediate clues he picked up on there? Not the finches yet, right?
Not the finches initially, no. Two things really struck him while he was on the islands. First, the giant tortoises.
The ones with different shells?
Yes. The vice governor told him the locals could tell which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell shape. On islands with lush vegetation near the ground, the tortoises had high, domed shells. On drier islands where they had to reach up for food, they had shells that flared up at the front like a saddle.
So form followed function, island by island.
It looked like it. Why would a creator make these distinct island-specific variations if they were all meant to be perfect? It suggested adaptation to local conditions.
And the second clue?
The mockingbirds. He collected several different types of mockingbirds from different islands. He noted they were distinct, yet clearly related. Again, why different species on different islands, all looking vaguely similar? It hinted at divergence from a common ancestor that must have somehow reached the islands.
Okay, now the famous finches.
Ooh.
The story's more complicated than just him having a eureka moment there, isn't it?
Much more complicated. He did collect the finches, about 13 species in the end, but he actually misidentified some of them, thought some were wrens or grosbeaks. He didn't label them all perfectly by island either. He just didn't grasp their full significance while he was there.
So when did the penny drop?
Back in London in 1837, he gave his bird collection to the ornithologist John Gould. Gould looked at these small, drab birds and realized, wait a minute, these are all finches, but they have wildly different beaks, some thick and heavy for crushing seeds, some delicate and pointed for probing insects, some shaped for eating cactus fruit.
All variations on a theme. Finch 2.0, Finch 3.0, adapted for different jobs.
Exactly. Gould pointed out they were all related, modified descendants of likely a single ancestral finch species that had colonized the islands and then diversified to fill all these different ecological niches. That was the real light bulb moment, but it happened after the voyage, thanks to expert analysis.
And we still study those finches today, don't we? The Grant's work.
Peter and Rosemary Grant, yes. Their long-term studies on Daphne Major Island are legendary. They've actually watched evolution happen in response to environmental changes like droughts. Well, during a severe drought, the only food left might be large, hard seeds. Only the finches with genetically larger, stronger beaks can crack them and survive. So in the very next generation, the average beak size of the finch population measurably increases.
Natural selection, caught in the act. Incredible validation.
Absolutely. Real-time proof of Darwin's mechanism.
Before we leave the Beagle voyage, there's one more major achievement, and it wasn't even biological. His theory about coral reefs.
Right, his theory of atoll formation. This shows his genius wasn't just about species, it was about seeing large-scale patterns and processes. The common idea was that coral atolls were reefs built on the rims of submerged volcanic craters.
But Darwin thought differently.
He proposed a much more dynamic process. Imagine a volcanic island emerging from the sea. Coral starts growing around its shores, forming a fringing reef. Now, Lyell's geology suggested land masses could slowly sink. Darwin theorized that as the volcanic island slowly subsided over vast timescales, the coral kept growing upwards towards the sunlight, keeping pace with the sinking.
So eventually the island disappears beneath the waves, but you're left with
a ring of living coral, an atoll marking where the shoreline used to be, surrounding a lagoon where the mountain peak once was.
That's elegant. And was he right?
Completely. It took deep drilling projects in the 20th century to confirm it, drilling down through coral and eventually hitting volcanic rock deep below. It showed his incredible ability to synthesize geological processes, subsidence, with biological responses, coral growth, over immense time. It proved he could build powerful, predictive scientific models.
Okay, so Darwin gets back to England in October 1836. He's famous now, welcomed into scientific circles thanks to his collections and letters, but inside he's wrestling with this huge, potentially dangerous idea.
That's right. By July 1837, spurred on by Gould's finch analysis and recalling the Patagonian fossils and Galapagos variations, he starts his first secret notebook on the transmutation of species. This is where he draws that first rough evolutionary tree and writes, I think he's convinced species change. But the big question is how?
And he decides to keep this, well, under wraps for a very long time.
For over 20 years. Why? The risk was enormous. Remember fixism. Remember the power of the church. Publishing an idea like transmutation, especially without overwhelming proof, could have ended his career, made him a pariah.
So he goes into this long period of almost clandestine research.
Meticulously gathering evidence, reading voraciously, doing experiments, writing letters, but only sharing the core idea, his great secret, with a tiny circle of trusted friends. Lyell, the geologist, and Joseph Hooker, the botanist.
And during this time, his personal life takes shape too. He gets married in 1839.
To his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And
Right.
famously, he drew up a list of pros and cons before proposing.
The analytical mind at work, concluding a wife was better than a dog anyhow. Charming.
Yes. But Emma was incredibly important. She provided stability, managed the household, cared for him through his illnesses, and crucially, despite her own deep religious faith, which made his ideas troubling for her, she remained supportive, a confidant.
They moved out of London in 1842, didn't they? The Down House in Kent.
Yes, seeking quiet and privacy for his work. Down House became his laboratory, his sanctuary. He turned rooms into study spaces, set up greenhouses, laid out experimental garden plots, and created his famous sand walk, the path he'd walk every day to think.
This period is also when his health problems really took hold. The mystery illness.
Yeah, this chronic, debilitating condition. Nausea, exhaustion, heart palpitations, severe anxiety, skin problems. It plagued him for decades. He saw doctor after doctor, but nobody could diagnose it definitively.
Theories range from Chagas disease, picked up in South America, to lactose intolerance, to maybe even psychosomatic effects from the sheer stress of his secret work.
We still don't know for sure. But Darwin himself wryly noted that his illness, in a way, protected him. It saved me from the distractions of society and amusement, he said. It forced him to focus almost entirely on his research.
That intense focus finally led to the breakthrough, the mechanism he'd been searching for, and it came from an unlikely source.
October 1838. He happens to read Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population, apparently for amusement.
Malthus, the economist writing about human population growth.
That's the one. Malthus argued that human populations tend to grow exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, while food supplies only grow arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4. The inevitable result: competition, struggle. Not everyone can survive. Famine, disease, war, these act as natural checks.
And Darwin reads this, and suddenly,
Click. He sees it applies universally. All organisms produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Look at fish eggs, acorns, pollen, vast numbers, but only a tiny fraction make it. So there must be a constant struggle for existence in nature, too.
okay, so there's a struggle. How does that lead to change?
Because, as Darwin had observed relentlessly, individuals within any species vary. They aren't identical clones. Some are slightly faster, slightly better camouflaged, slightly more resistant to disease, have a beak slightly better shaped for the available food. Just tiny random differences.
And in that struggle for existence,
Those tiny random advantages matter. An individual with a slight edge, however small, is marginally more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. And crucially, if that advantageous trait is heritable.
it gets passed on to the next generation.
Exactly. While those without the advantage are slightly less likely to survive and reproduce. Over many, many generations, operating across vast populations and deep time, these tiny advantages accumulate. The species gradually changes. That accumulation, driven by differential survival and reproduction, is natural selection.
It's so elegant and almost mechanical.
Mhm.
No guiding hand needed. Just variation, inheritance, and the brutal maths of survival.
Purely naturalistic. And as you said earlier, we see it happening constantly. Antibiotic resistance is the textbook case. Introduce an antibiotic, that's the selection pressure. Most bacteria die. But a few, by random chance, have a mutation that lets them survive. They reproduce. Soon, the whole population is resistant. That's natural selection, fast-forwarded.
But this idea of nature being this relentless filter, it's pretty abstract. How did Darwin make it understandable to people back then?
He used analogies, really clever ones. The first was artificial selection.
Breeding, like dogs or horses.
Exactly. Darwin became obsessed with pigeon breeding. He joined clubs, bred them himself at Down House. He showed how human breeders, by deliberately selecting tiny variations, they like a feather color here, a beak shape there, could, over generations, create dramatically different pigeon breeds, all from one common ancestor, the rock dove.
So the argument was, if humans can make such big changes by choosing traits in just a few decades or centuries.
Imagine what nature, selecting relentlessly for survival advantage over millions of years, could achieve. It made the abstract concept concrete and relatable.
Brilliant. And there was another analogy, something about an industry.
Kind of, yeah. More an ecological principle, framed perhaps with an industrial metaphor. He observed that successful industries often specialized, dividing labor. Nature does something similar.
How so?
To reduce direct competition. If two types of finches eat the exact same seeds, they're in intense competition. But if one group evolves a beak better suited for slightly different, smaller seeds, and another evolves one for larger seeds, they partition the resource. They specialize.
Find their own niche.
Exactly. This ecological specialization reduces head-to-head competition and allows more different forms to coexist. It explains why life branches out, becomes more diverse over time. It's the driving force behind that branching tree diagram he sketched way back in 1837.
So Darwin has a theory, natural selection. He has the evidence gathered over 2 decades. He's slowly writing this enormous book, planning maybe for 1860 publication, perhaps later. And then June 1858, letter arrives.
The letter from Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a naturalist much younger than Darwin, working out in the Malay archipelago, Indonesia, Malaysia today.
And the letter contained
A manuscript outlining, well, basically the theory of evolution by natural selection. Wallace had figured it out independently, apparently during a bout of malarial fever. He saw the same Malthusian struggle, the same role of variation, and he sent it to Darwin, of all people, asking for his opinion and maybe help getting it published.
Oh my God, imagine opening that after 20 years of secret work.
Darwin was floored, utterly devastated. He wrote to Lyell, "All my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." He felt completely forestalled.
What happened next? It could have turned into a nasty priority dispute.
It could have, but it didn't, thanks to Darwin's friends, Lyell and Hooker. They brokered what's called the gentlemanly solution. They knew Darwin had been working on this for years. They'd seen drafts.
So they arranged a joint presentation.
Exactly. On July 1st, 1858, at the Linnean Society of London, they presented Wallace's paper alongside extracts from Darwin's unpublished 1844 essay and a letter he'd sent to the American botanist Asa Gray in 1857, clearly outlining natural selection.
Establishing Darwin's prior work while giving Wallace full credit for his independent discovery.
Precisely. It was handled very honorably. Interestingly, neither Darwin nor Wallace were actually there for the presentation. Darwin was mourning his infant son who had just died of scarlet fever, and Wallace was still out in Malay Archipelago.
And the reaction at the meeting? Was it explosive?
Surprisingly, no. The idea was so new, so different, it seems it barely registered at first. The Linnean Society president later remarked that 1858 had not been marked by any striking discoveries.
Wow. But it definitely lit a fire under Darwin, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Wallace letter forced his hand. He abandoned the idea of the massive multi-volume work and rushed to write up a shorter version, what he modestly called an abstract.
And that abstract was?
On the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Published November 24th, 1859, the entire print run, 1,250 copies, sold out on the first day.
And the structure of that book was key to his impact, wasn't it?
Absolutely masterful. He starts with the familiar artificial selection, pigeons easing the reader in. Then he builds the case for natural selection, drawing on geology, fossils, the geographical distribution of species, embryology, vestigial organs. Layer upon layer of evidence from every field of natural history, all pointing towards one conclusion: common descent modified by natural selection. It wasn't just a theory, it was a synthesis of all biology up to that point.
And this time, the reaction was immediate and intense.
Oh yeah, it split the scientific community and the public right down the middle. Fierce debate erupted.
Who were the main players in that fight?
Leading the charge for Darwin was Thomas Huxley, brilliant anatomist, sharp debater. He immediately saw the power and implications of the theory and became its most vocal public champion, earning the nickname Darwin's Bulldog.
And on the other side,
ironically, one of the most prominent critics was Richard Owen, another top anatomist, the guy who'd actually helped Darwin identify his beagle fossils years before. Owen seems to have been driven by a mix of scientific disagreement. He held a more complex, archetypal view of life, and perhaps some professional jealousy. He attacked the theory, sometimes even anonymously.
This all came to a head in that famous showdown at Oxford in 1860, right? The British Association meeting.
The legendary Huxley-Wilberforce debate. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, a skilled orator but not a scientist, was basically fed lines by Owen to attack Darwin's book.
And he made that sarcastic crack at Huxley about whether he was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side.
That's the famous story. And Huxley's supposed retort that he'd rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his eloquence to obscure the truth became iconic. Whether the exchange happened exactly like that is debated by historians, but the event absolutely symbolized the clash.
Science versus religious authority. Rationalism versus tradition.
Exactly. Origin wasn't just a science book. It had unleashed a cultural storm that touched on the very definition of humanity and its place in the universe.
So Origin is out, the battle lines are drawn. But Darwin didn't just sit back and watch the fireworks, did he? He kept working.
Relentlessly. He saw Origin as just the beginning. He spent the next 2 decades publishing detailed studies that fleshed out aspects of the theory using experiments and observations from Downhouse.
Like his work on orchids.
Yes, his book on the fertilization of orchids in 1862 was brilliant. He showed how these incredibly complex, bizarre flower structures were not examples of perfect divine design, but were actually highly specialized adaptations, evolved step by step through natural selection, often in intricate co-evolutionary relationships with specific insect pollinators.
Demonstrating how complex structures could arise gradually.
Exactly. He also published on climbing plants, showing the diverse mechanisms they'd evolved. And his very last book, published in 1881, just before he died, was all about earthworms.
Earthworms.
Seriously. Yes. He'd been studying them for decades, fascinated by their collective impact on forming topsoil. It showed his enduring curiosity about all natural processes, big and small, and his commitment to careful, quantitative observation.
And that detailed work, like on pollination, is still relevant.
Absolutely. Research today on how climate change is disrupting plant-pollinator relationships builds directly on Darwin's foundational insights into coevolution and adaptation.
But there was one massive topic he deliberately downplayed in Origin: humanity.
He only hinted at it right at the end, famously writing, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." He knew it was explosive. He finally tackled it head-on in 1871 with The Descent of Man and selection in relation to sex.
Okay, so 2 big things in that book. First, explicitly applying evolution to humans.
Yes, arguing clearly that humans share a common ancestor with apes and other primates, placing us firmly within the evolutionary tree.
And second, introducing another key evolutionary mechanism.
Sexual selection. He realized natural selection, survival of the fittest, couldn't explain certain traits, like the massive, cumbersome tail of a peacock. That tail makes it harder to survive, easier for predators to catch.
So why have it?
Because the peons prefer it. Sexual selection is about reproductive success, not just survival. It's driven by either competition between members of one sex, usually males fighting for access to females, think stags locking antlers, or by mate choice, usually females choosing males based on certain traits, like that peacock's tail or elaborate bird songs.
So it explains traits that give a mating advantage, even if they come at a survival cost.
Exactly. It's a hugely important addition to evolutionary theory, explaining a whole range of features natural selection alone couldn't account for.
But Descent of Man, it also has some deeply problematic aspects, reflecting the time it was written in.
It absolutely does. We have to acknowledge that. Darwin, while progressive in some ways like his opposition to slavery, was still a product of Victorian England. The book contains sections that reflect the racial and sexual prejudices of that era, arguing, for instance, for a hierarchy of human races and inherent differences in intellect between men and women.
Views that modern science has thoroughly debunked.
Completely. Modern genetics shows human populations are remarkably similar, biologically one species. Neuroscience finds no basis for inherent cognitive superiority based on race or sex. Science moves on, corrects itself, and rejects the biases of the past, even those of its greatest figures.
This issue of bias leads into perhaps the most damaging distortion of his work: social Darwinism.
Yes, this toxic ideology that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. People misused, really, twisted Darwin's concepts like struggle for existence and survival of the fittest to justify social inequalities.
Arguing that the rich and powerful were just naturally superior, that poverty was a sign of biological inferiority, and that interfering, like providing social welfare, was hindering natural progress. Used to justify racism, imperialism, laissez-faire capitalism.
Horrific stuff. And it's crucial to state, Darwin himself did not endorse this. Our sources show he argued the opposite. He He saw human morality, sympathy, and altruism caring for the weak as products of evolution, particularly in civilized societies. He saw these as virtues to be encouraged, not obstacles to progress. Social Darwinism was a perversion of his ideas, not an extension of them.
Moving towards the end of his life, it wasn't all science. He faced personal hardships, too.
Deeply so. The death of his cherished daughter Annie in 1851 at age 10 was a devastating blow. Many historians believe this tragedy, the inability to reconcile such suffering with a loving God, was the final factor in his loss of conventional religious faith.
He continued working almost until the end, though.
He did. He died in April 1882 at Down House. The public and scientific outcry for him to be honored was immense.
And he was buried in Westminster Abbey. A huge statement.
Right next to Sir Isaac Newton. It cemented his place as one of the absolute giants of science, someone who had fundamentally changed humanity's view of itself and the cosmos.
His legacy, scientifically, is just monumental. Modern biology is unthinkable without him.
As the biologist Dovzhansky said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And everything discovered since genetics, DNA, genomics has only confirmed and deepened our understanding of the mechanisms he first outlined. Finding the gene as the unit of inheritance was the missing piece he knew had to exist.
And his ideas have spread far beyond biology now, haven't they, into the 21st century?
Massively. Think about evolutionary algorithms in computer science.
Explain that quickly. How does that work?
It's literally Darwinism in code. You want to solve a complex design problem. You generate lots of random potential solutions. That's variation. You test how well they work against set criteria, selection. You take the best ones, maybe combine their features, add a few random tweaks, and generate a new set of solutions, inheritance with mutation. Repeat thousands of times. The computer evolves incredibly effective solutions humans might never think of.
Used for designing efficient jet engines, optimizing logistics, even training AI.
All sorts of things. Then there's cultural evolution, tracking how ideas, beliefs, technologies, even internet memes spread and change through populations via processes that look a lot like variation, selection, and inheritance, usually much faster than biological evolution, of course.
And critically, evolutionary medicine.
Absolutely vital. Understanding why we get sick. Why do diseases persist? How do pathogens like bacteria and viruses evolve resistance to drugs? How do cancer cells evolve within the body to evade treatment? We can only combat these threats effectively if we see them as evolving populations, applying Darwinian principles to predict their next move and design better strategies.
So beyond the science, his biggest impact might be philosophical, right? How we see ourselves.
I think so. He knocked humanity off its pedestal, showed we aren't separate from nature, created above it all. We are part of nature, deeply connected through shared ancestry to every other living thing on this planet. A recent twig on an immense ancient tree of life. That's a profound and I think ultimately humbling and beautiful realization. Summing it up, Darwin's revolution wasn't just scientific. It was philosophical, cultural. And his method, that painstaking, interdisciplinary collection of evidence from everywhere, the willingness to follow the data wherever it led, even against established beliefs that set a standard for how science should be done.
And that evolutionary story, including our own, it's still going on. We see subtle genetic shifts in human populations, adapting to altitude, digesting milk, but also this incredibly rapid cultural evolution, turbocharged by technology now.
And his core ideas remain essential tools. You want to understand how species might adapt or fail to adapt to climate change? You need Darwin. You want to fight the next pandemic or the rise of superbugs? You need Darwin.
It really comes back to seeing ourselves within that vast, dynamic web of life he revealed. So for you, our listeners here at the Urban Herald, our final thought to chew on. We live in the Anthropocene, an age where human activity is the dominant force shaping the planet. We're creating intense new selection pressures, pollution, habitat loss, climate shifts, urbanization.
Evolution often happens fastest under strong pressure. So looking ahead, thinking about that tree of life Darwin first sketched. What new branches, what surprising adaptations, maybe even what entirely new forms of life might emerge from the unprecedented evolutionary experiment we humans are currently running on a global scale.